Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. We are continuing our discussions of Aristotle, and we have entered what I'm thinking of as the last section, right? It's not put this way in the syllabus, but basically we've gone over the logic, right? That was the first section. Then we mostly looked at the physics and we looked at some supplementary materials in the metaphysics that helped us understand the physics better. At least that's what I was trying to do with those excerpts from the metaphysics, right? And now we're going into the ethics, and this is the most practical part of Aristotle, right? And so we're going to end on a practical note that will help you more directly with your life, I hope. That's what we're going for here. We've learned some things from the logic and the physics and the metaphysics that will help us in the ethics, and let me go over that briefly. Okay, so we've learned a lot about what substance is, right? That's a key notion in the physics and the metaphysics. It even plays a role in the logic. So there's a long discussion in the texts that we've already looked at, right, about whether substance is really form, or it's really matter, or it's really the composite of form and matter, right? And mainly Aristotle wants to say form is substance, right? And in a lesser way, in a somewhat derivative way, the composite is also a substance, okay? And both of these views affect the ethics to some extent. So first of all, with regard to form, which is the primary notion of substance, right? When we are looking at a biological organism like the human being, form is the same as soul, right? So last week, when we were thinking about the different causes, right? We were thinking about form as a cause, for instance, right? We were thinking about form as a cause of a human and form as a cause of a frog, right? And I came up with this phrase, functional arrangement of human parts and functional arrangement of frog parts, right? That's what the form is, and that's when we're thinking about the form as a cause, that's a good way to think about it, right? And notice I said functional arrangement. So function is key here to understanding form, which again is the same as the soul when it comes to a biological organism. So to spell it out a little more, when you look at the frog specifically, it might help to look at the frog first, and then we'll apply that later to human beings. So the frog's organs, including its sensory organs and its skin, all the different organs, right? They're arranged in such a way that they help it live a froggy sort of life, right? And what is a froggy sort of life? What does that look like? What does it involve? Well, most simply, just sort of going by the stereotype of frogs, I guess. They hop and they like flies. They like to eat flies, right? And presumably other insects. And those two things are related. They have to hop to get the flies sometimes. In any case, their bodies are arranged in such a way that they have these relatively long, powerful hind legs that allow them to hop, and they also have a very long, sticky tongue, right, that can dart out quickly toward the flies. right? So when we talk about the soul of the frog, that will sound odd to us, but Aristotle wants to talk that way. We're just talking about the way that its parts come together to help it do froggy things, right? Its legs are made of a certain material, right? There's all kinds of organic material in those legs. But when we're talking about form, we're talking about the structure of those legs and how, again, they're relatively long compared to its body and how they're relatively well muscled, right? And those help it hop. And if it can't hop well, it's not a good frog. So, the soul makes it what it is, and it also makes it, to the extent that the soul is good and doing what it's supposed to, it makes the frog a good frog. It makes it good of its kind, right? The material matters, but the form is shaping the material to allow the frog to do what it does. And this is exactly the sort of thing that leads Aristotle to favor form over matter when he's talking about what the substance of a thing is. Okay, so a composite substance like a frog is determined to behave the way that it does by its soul, right? And that soul is helping it live a certain kind of life. And all of this applies to human beings, and it's all relevant to the ethics. Our bodies are shaped in a certain way. As we'll see, they're shaped to allow us to express rationality and to be rational, like the tongue. I mean, Aristotle doesn't get into this much detail, but the tongue is very dexterous for human beings, and so our tongue can move in such a way as to create a wide array of sounds that allow us to construct different words that stand for different concepts. So the tongue, right, is formed in a way that allows us to express our rationality, and we like to build things and write and type with our hands, right? And so this expresses, or these hands, they express our rationality as well, right? So our bodies are arranged in such a way that they allow reason to be in charge, or at least that's Aristotle's view, right? And we might think, well, we're not as rational as we believe, and sure, that's fine. But we are, for Aristotle, the distinctly rational being, and even if lots of other animals exhibit more rationality than Aristotle realized, our reason affects our behavior in lots of different ways, large and small. And so does our sociality, right? Our desire to live with each other also affects us quite a bit. And Aristotle realizes that. So on the one hand, he calls us the rational animal, but then also sometimes he calls us the social animal, right? We choose sociality, right? That's not clear in the case of ants and bees, say, right? They might just be naturally social. We're kind of impressed with what they're able to accomplish together. I'm not denigrating that. But when you look at humans, right, humans vary quite a bit across the individuals in ways that ants and bees don't. You see a lot of variation in individual human behavior. So there seems to be choice there, although you could get into arguments about free will, but just looking, observing, seems like there's lots of individual choice. Among humans, they're exercising their rational faculties to make individual choices. and yet humans keep choosing to live together, right? So that also plays a role in the ethics. Okay, so which ethics are we talking about? Aristotle wrote more than one ethical work. Well, we're looking at the Nicomachean ethics. Why is it called the Nicomachean ethics? A bit later in life, after his wife had died, Aristotle took up with a lady named Herpyllis of Stagira. Now, Aristotle himself was originally from Stagira. There's a long story here that I haven't really given you yet, and I'm not going to get into it too much now, but let's just say when Aristotle was young, when he was 17, he went to Athens, he studied under Plato at the academy, and that went on for something like 20 years. And then Plato died, and Plato's nephew took over the academy, and Aristotle left. Maybe he wanted to be in charge of the academy. We don't know. We simply don't know. He did a lot of other things outside of Athens, including tutor Alexander the Great, famously, right? And then he came back to Athens, okay? And somewhere in there, he married, but then his wife died. So he came back to Athens and set up his own school, the Lyceum. And like I said, he took up with Herpyllis of Stagira at this point. Again, his hometown, so the instant connection, I guess, right? And then they had a son named Nicomachean, right? And also the son was named after Aristotle's father, Nicomachean, right? So the book is dedicated perhaps mainly to the son, trying to give him a good ethical upbringing, perhaps, but also it's an homage to his father. So either way, the book is named after Aristotle's family. He's trying to honor his family members by calling it the Nicomachean Ethics, or else an editor is trying to honor Aristotle's family. We don't even know for sure who named the book, right? But somebody was trying to honor Aristotle's family members here. Okay, so let's get into the book. I'm going to start by reading, actually. This book is really dense, just like a lot of Aristotle is dense. So sometimes if you read a little bit, there's a lot there to unpack. So I'm just going to go to the very beginning, book 1, chapter 1, right? This is 1094A, is, pretty much starts there at 1094A. Every craft and every method of inquiry, and likewise every action and deliberate choice, seems to seek some good. That is why they correctly declare that the good is that which all seek. A certain difference, however, appears to exist among ends, for some are activities while others are works of some sort beyond the activities themselves. But wherever there are ends beyond the actions, in those cases, the works are naturally better than the activities. Okay, so let's pause there. We might read some more. But what are we seeing so far? Everything we do aims at some good. Also, specific crafts and specific sciences aim at the good, right? In general, Aristotle would say, although it's not necessarily clear here, that organisms aim at their own good in general. This is not just for humans. So on the one hand, we're just seeing Aristotle tell you that this is a rational universe, right? So naturally things go after the good, right? What's good for them. But also he's saying when it comes to human choice, right? Of course, humans choose the good. I mean, those are basic criteria for choosing. Do I want a bad outcome or do I want a good outcome? Well, we can say, even though it's a general thing to say, it's not necessarily that informative. Well, of course, we want the good outcome, and then what good means in a specific area or circumstance, that can vary a lot. But we're able to say, right, in general, what we want is the good outcome, right? And so, we're sort of working up to the point that, of course, ethics is seeking the good. So the nature of ethics is going to be determined by what's good for human beings. That's not explicit here. I'm telling you where we're going. That's what this is working up to. Right? And then also, there's a distinction being made between goods or products as ends and activities as ends. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, if you're a smith, you might be a metalsmith, right? You're making products, so you're making swords and knives, say, right? And whatever else metalsmiths make. But in any case, the sort of thing Aristotle is saying is if you're working on a sword all day, the sword is the best thing to come out of that, right? We can tell because you've decided to invest your time and energy in making the sword. So the sword is lending the value to what you're doing. So the sword is the good that organizes the activity here, right? And makes sense of the activity. But sometimes there's an activity, like an overarching activity, that makes sense of lower level activities. So for instance, you might put on a play, right? The Greeks liked to put on plays. Well, the play is an activity more than it's a product, but of course there are sub-activities involved, right? So somebody had to cast the actors, and the actors had to learn their lines, and they had to do rehearsals. And then there's the actual putting on of the play, which is this large, complex activity, right? And then that's the good that makes sense of the activities that led up to it and that lends those activities value, right? When the actors are rehearsing, it's toward the good of putting on the play, and so their rehearsing gets value from what it's going toward, right? So some activity could be going toward a product, and some activity could be going toward another activity, right? And then to understand why we're bringing this up about activities and sub-activities, let's read another part. Still in 1094a, now I'm skipping down near line 10. Some of these fall under some one capacity, however. We're talking about actions now, actions/activities that people do. Some of these fall under some one capacity, however, as bridle making falls under horsemanship, along with all the others that produce equipment for horsemanship, and as it and every action in warfare fall under generalship, and in the same way others fall under different ones. But in all such cases, the ends of the architectonic ones are more choice-worthy than the ends under them, since these are pursued for the sake also of the former. Okay, that might have sounded complicated, but I'm sure you got the idea that, okay, well, when you make bridles, those are for riding horses, right? So bridle making falls under horsemanship. So there's the riding and equipping of horses, right? And that's an activity, and that falls under generalship. In other words, the making of war, the creating of strategy to make war, right? That's what generals are responsible for. They employ horses, among other things, so horsemanship falls under generalship. And then bridle making is just one part of getting the horses ready and well equipped so they can do whatever it is they're supposed to do. Right, so you have higher level activities and lower level activities, right? And when Aristotle uses that word architectonic, there's the more architectonic, he means higher, right? And the less architectonic, not that he uses that phrase, but he could. The lower level activities are underneath those higher architectonic activities. The point of all this is that generalship is aimed at winning wars and battles. So then, in a sense, horsemanship is aimed at that as well. Now, there might be competing uses for horses, and that's fine, but we'll ignore that, right, to make it simple. So let's just say, well, horsemanship gets its value from generalship, which gets its value from military victory, right? And then that goes all the way down to bridle making. Then bridle making ultimately gets its value from military victory on this view, right? Okay, so yeah, bridle making and horsemanship might have these other values, but we're simplifying to get the main point here, and the main point is that there are layers of activity, right? Lower level activities contribute to higher ones. What is the purpose of it all? Well, you have to look at the highest level activity and see what that is aimed at. And then you know what the purpose of it all is. And then that's where the value is coming from. So that's the good that all of the activity is aimed at, right? Okay. And so then that tees us up well for chapter 2. So again, I'm going to go ahead and read Aristotle. I'm just going to read from the beginning of chapter 2 here. If then there is some end of things doable in action that we wish for because of itself, and the others because of it, and we do not choose everything because of something else, and I'll skip the parenthetical point, it is clear that this will be the good, that is, the best good. Hence, regarding our life as well, won't knowing the good have great influence, and like archers with a target, won't we be better able to hit what we should? If so, we should try to grasp and outline at least what the good is and to which of the sciences or capacities it properly belongs. I'm going to keep reading here just a little bit more. It would seem to be the one with the most control and the most architectonic one. And politics seems to be like this, since it is the one that prescribes which of the sciences need to exist in cities and which ones each group in cities should learn and up to what point. Okay, so in chapter 1 we established that there are layers, that there are subordinate activities and superordinate or architectonic activities. I might start saying superordinate now because it has a nice complement. Subordinate versus superordinate. I like that there's a complementary pair there, so I might stick with that now. Anyway, that's what we got out of chapter 1. There are subordinate activities and superordinate activities. In chapter 2, Aristotle is starting to suggest that, well, there could be some super end, some greatest good that we're constantly pursuing, and that would make sense, right? Because the parenthetical that I skipped says, well, otherwise human action might be futile, right? In other words, you've probably had this sort of thought. Everybody goes through a period where they have these sorts of thoughts. So I'm going to school, right? I'm taking my classes. I'm going to get a degree. That's great. Well, what is that for? Well, it's so I can be more knowledgeable and have some skills and get a job. Okay. So what is the good of getting a job and having skills and being knowledgeable? I can make some money and contribute to society, so I do good things for other people and I get good things in return. What's the good of doing good things for other people, and what's the good of my making money? Well, I can use the money to get good stuff, and if I do good things for other people, it makes me feel good, and maybe they'll do nice things for me in return. On and on you could go for a while, right? But why do I want good things in my life? I was already getting there with respect to helping other people. That side of it's a little easier. It's easy to say, well, ultimately it makes me happy. It makes them happy, which makes me happy, right? But we end up in the same place with respect to getting a job and making money and getting good stuff and having a house and all. What's the point of all that? Well, it can't end with a product. Actually, we've already made this distinction between products and activities. There is no material thing that could be the point here, because you could very easily ask about the new boat or the new car or the new house. Well, why did you get that? And that question makes perfect sense. We can always raise it. But at some point, you're finally going to say, well, it just makes me happy. It contributes to the way I'm living my life. It's a happy life. It's going well. And, I need a house for my family where we can live our happy life. Ultimately, Aristotle's not mentioning happiness quite yet. I'm kind of jumping the gun. But he is saying, well, shouldn't there be an ultimate good so that human action isn't pointless and futile? Yeah, there should. So instead of jumping to the good, what he actually does is he jumps to the most superordinate science instead, right? Because we already had this discussion about layers. So he's also saying, he's not just saying, shouldn't there be like a best good, a highest good? He's also saying, shouldn't there be a most superordinate science? And isn't there a most superordinate science? And the answer is yes, and he says it's politics. And why is it politics? Because it tells us how to live collectively, right? And so our broad pattern of life includes all these other things we do, including studying philosophy and physics. So even though theoretically philosophy is on top for Aristotle, and physics and metaphysics are pretty high up there too, practically speaking, politics is on top, because it's allowing us to arrange our lives together. So politics is the most superordinate activity. And then, pretty quickly you get into chapter 3 and chapter 4. it becomes clear that politics is aimed at happiness, right? So on the one hand, we could just sort of go directly there, which I did. I jumped the gun, and Aristotle says some of the same things later. There is some highest good, and we'll argue for it more later, but it certainly makes sense to say that happiness is the ultimate sort of value my life can have. So other things that I do to contribute to happiness, right? And then, should I be selfish? Well, that's definitely not what Aristotle is saying, so I'll try to nip that one in the bud. My happiness includes the happiness of some others. Like, it's an indefinite set. I have friends, I have family. There is a certain set of people. It varies from person to person, but for me specifically, there's a distinct set of people that I could probably pick out, whose happiness is bound up with my own, right? So we do everything for happiness, but not in a selfish way. My happiness includes the happiness of some friends and family members that I'm particularly close to. Okay. And then, politics governs how we live, so it governs the way that we collectively pursue happiness. And then, of course, this book is on ethics. There's a separate book on politics. But what Aristotle is suggesting, he could be more clear about it, is that ethics is sort of the individual component of politics, right? Or the individual addendum to politics. Politics is higher and more important. It is the most superordinate after all. But if we understand politics, we understand that we need to flourish collectively and be happy collectively. And then there are corollaries for how an individual is supposed to be happy and pursue happiness. And then that's what ethics is about. So ethics is about my happiness. However, that's all in a political context, right? And so my happiness will impinge on the happiness of other people in various ways that we can talk about as we proceed through the ethics. Aristotle has plenty to say about our being social animals, and when we do finally look at specific virtues, we'll see that all the virtues of character, for sure, have a strong social component, right? And there are also intellectual virtues, and then we have to think more about whether they have a social component. That's something that merits discussion. We won't be getting to that today. Okay, so we've already looked at chapters 1 and 2. Let's say some brief things about chapter 3 and chapter 4. We don't need to say a lot about them. Chapter 3 comments on the exactness we should expect from this kind of inquiry, and it also discusses who can benefit from this kind of inquiry. The main thing Aristotle wants to say about exactness is that ethics is not a very exact science. It's not like mathematics, so don't expect that same level of exactness when we're doing ethics that you would expect if we were doing geometry, say. And the reason has a lot to do with the good, the nature of the good, right? The exactness of the discipline is keyed to what the discipline is about. Ethics is about the good. The good is not an exact notion in the way that, the shape of a square or the number 2 is an exact notion. So I've already said Well, what's good in a specific situation is a little tricky, right? The richer description we give, the more we're able to say what's good, right? But there's a lot of context that matters. A lot of background information is important. So the good is not as determinate as the objects of some other disciplines and inquiries, right? And to be clear, Aristotle is not a relativist. Excuse me. We don't want to impose that on him. So we have to be careful here. We don't want to use our modern eyes and our modern ears and say, oh, I'm hearing relativism. No, the good is indeterminate. Or at least, compared to the objects of other disciplines and inquiries, it's not as determinate as some of the others, right? You need a lot of context to figure out what's really good. So if he were a relativist, right, usually what people mean by that is, well, it's relative to culture or relative to your subjective impressions. That's not what he's saying. It's more along the lines that it's situational, right? So you've got to distinguish these two things, or you're going to misunderstand Aristotle. So the good doesn't depend on your subjective impressions. That will be pretty clear as we proceed. And the good doesn't depend on what culture you're in, because it's more beholden to rationality than that. And Aristotle certainly doesn't see rationality as changing from culture to culture. Some contemporary folks go that route. That's not Aristotle's route, right? To be clear, what he is a situationalist. That's not really the technical term. People tend to say particularist, right? What's good in a given situation is particular to that situation, and so there is an objective right answer to what is good. It's not subjectively determined, but also it's complicated and varies a lot from situation to situation because different situations are different, right? So ethics, all of this is to say, ethics is not an exact science, or certainly not the most exact science, right? Who benefits? Basically, Aristotle says mature people, and mainly he means people who can control their emotional responses, right? So the very young, whatever exactly that means, the very young can't benefit. So should you try to teach ethics to sixth graders? Well, not at the level that Aristotle is teaching it, right? And his reasoning, I'm just speaking for him. Try what you want, but his point is that look, I can tell you what the virtues are, and I can tell you to cultivate courage and cultivate moderation, and that's great. But if you can't control your emotions, then you can't do what I'm advising you to do, right? So that's what it's about. You could be 60 years old and not have good emotional control, and then you're not mature enough for ethics, right? But there's some age group that's too young, even if we don't know which group exactly it is empirically. Aristotle knows he needs a somewhat older audience. He could teach logic however that might sound to you, his view would be, well, he could teach logic to a younger group. They might have the intellectual capacity for that, right, if you get the right group. But here, we really are dealing with maturity, right? It's not a matter. I mean, maybe that's the main point we should focus on. If we're thinking about who to teach ethics to, it's not just a matter of intellectual capacity like it would be with other things. You have to think about the level of emotional maturity. Are you talking to a group who can cultivate moderation? Well, in order to cultivate moderation, they'd have to abstain from a lot of things. Are you talking to a group who can do that? Or if they wanted to cultivate mildness, say, which means they're not prone to anger, they're not easily angered. Are you dealing with a group that's ready to handle something like that? I mean, if you're talking to 13 and 14-year-olds, that's a pretty emotionally dysregulated group, and I'm telling you this as a parent. So, who can benefit people with emotional control? We could leave it at that. Upbringing matters in a different way. Aristotle explains later in chapter 4. Starting points are very important for Aristotle, as I think you've seen, right? Every science has its own distinct principles, its own starting points, right? Now, in ethics, the starting points are these basic ethical facts like virtue in general is good, and moderation is good, and courage is good, things like that. The starting points are not highly abstract and theoretical, as they are in some other areas. And in fact, maybe they're not theoretical at all, because when we say courage is good, in a sense, we're exhorting people, encouraging, in other words, or recommending, or something like that, more than we're describing. Right? If we say courage is good, we're saying be courageous, act courageously, right? And then if we've had a certain upbringing, we've already got the starting points. Okay, so upbringing is very important for doing ethics. If somebody doesn't learn as a young child that virtue is important, you can't necessarily teach them later, right? That's really what it comes down to here. The starting points are not just facts, they're evaluative, right? Again, if I say courage is good, am I really describing courage, or am I exhorting you? Seems like I'm exhorting you. I'm trying to get you to do something. I'm giving you an evaluation of courage, and I want you to share in that evaluation. And if you weren't raised the right way, what Aristotle thinks of the right way, you just might never see this. And he may not have an argument to show you that courage specifically is good. He can argue that virtue is good. He will. And that argument will be very abstract. So then when it comes to specific virtues like mildness, if you don't know that it's good, he won't necessarily have an argument that will convince you. I mean, I'm sure Aristotle could make an argument for anything. That's not the point. It's not that an argument is impossible. It's just an argument that would convince someone who doesn't already have the starting points, who didn't have the right upbringing, that might not be possible, or it might not be possible in certain cases. Okay, in chapter 5, Aristotle mentions these 3 lives. He says that people get their idea of what's good from the lives they lead, and so he mentions these different kinds of lives that people lead, right? He says the most vulgar people suppose that the good is pleasure because they live a life of indulgence, right? So one kind of life is indulgence, just being hedonistic, pursuing as much pleasure as possible. Okay, so people who live that kind of life think pleasure is the best. I mean, it's not clear they'll say that if you ask them. They don't necessarily value theoretical pursuits, but if you watch them, if you see how they live, you can see that they're putting pleasure as the highest value, right? And then there are those who pursue honor, right? So people in politics and people in the military are often pursuing honor. Right. So those are certain kinds of lives, right? You want esteem from those around you. You want to move up the ranks and have people look at you as the best or one of the best. These are things people do in politics, in the military, and honor seems to be the good for them. And they might say that they're more reflective than the indulgent people, right? So maybe that's what they would say if you asked them. Or maybe they'll say, well, I want to serve. But they want to be known as someone who serves well, which is to be honored, right? I think that's a fair thing. I'm not doubting their sincerity at all. I'm saying, yes, they want to serve, but they want to be known for serving well. They want to be known for providing good service to the military, to the state of Colorado, to the country, right? So they are pursuing honor. That seems correct, and that's Aristotle's view. And then there are people who study, who contemplate. There are academics. There are people who read a lot, right? And maybe for them, contemplation or thinking about things, perhaps especially thinking about highest things, thinking about the architectonic sciences, that's the highest good. Okay, well, Aristotle's got arguments against the first 2 things. Right? The life of pleasure is a life for grazing animals. Right? In other words, the functional view is coming up here already, and this will be more clear later. The life of indulgence doesn't exercise our distinctively human functions. Right? That's the point of saying it's a life of grazing cattle or whatever. It sounds insulting, and I'm sure it's somewhat meant as insulting, but there is a technical point here, and the technical point is, well, we have distinctively human functions, and you're not exercising those if you're just a complete hedonist, right? That's the point. As for honor, it seems superficial, Aristotle says. I guess he doesn't mind being insulting, but but again, there's a technical point here, and the technical point is people have to give you honor, right? So Aristotle suspects, he hasn't argued for it yet, he suspects that happiness is something that's hard to take from you, so probably something intrinsic and internal. But honor is not intrinsic and internal. Honor is relational, right? I have to be honored to have honor, right? It's coming from other people. It's coming from the outside. And that's what he means when he says it seems like it's too superficial, right? So pleasure and honor probably aren't the highest goods, although these arguments are preliminary. He doesn't have an argument against contemplation, and that's because later in Book 10, he'll argue that contemplation is one of the highest goods. It turns out in Book 10, there are at least two happy lives, and one of them is the life of virtue of character, doing good things for good people, and the other is the life of the intellectual virtues. And then the highest activity involved, or the highest activity that involves the intellectual virtues, is contemplation, right? So contemplation is left intact. We don't get much of an argument for it here, but we can tell something from the fact that he doesn't attack it. And then the life of money making, people usually, when they talk about this chapter, they talk about the three lives, and that's because of Aristotle's statement near the beginning of the chapter, for there are three lives that stand out. Well, those have already been covered. Indulgence and pursuit of honor and contemplation, right? Those are the three lives. And then at the end, there's a dismissal of the life of money making. It's not even important enough to be one of the three lives. The problem with the life of money making is that money is what we need, right? So this is a life of necessity and need, and so Aristotle sees that as externally imposed, right? Pleasure is choice-worthy. It's just not the highest good. And honor is choice-worthy. It's just not the highest good. And contemplation is choice-worthy. Money is a merely instrumental good. It has no intrinsic value. From Aristotle's point of view, it's not choice-worthy. So there are lots of people that are living their lives primarily by trying to make money, right? And some of them make a lot, and some of them make a little. And Aristotle doesn't distinguish, which you might do that. But Aristotle looks at people barely scraping by and says, that's not the best life. That's a life of necessity. And then he looks at merchants who do really well and make a lot of money, and he has the same thing to say. It's a life of necessity, right? Hopefully they're contemplating on the side. Hopefully they're using their money to set up a nice library so they can sit in their library and think interesting thoughts, right, with the help of other people, the authors they're reading, in other words, right? That's the way Aristotle would look at it. Okay, well, think about that what you will. That brings us to chapter 7. Okay, now we've made it to chapter 7 of book 1, and that's great because chapter 7 is full of really important points. I guess I'd have to say it's the centerpiece of book 1, right? And if we can understand chapter 7, then we can probably make sense of the rest of the book. Okay, so what happens here in chapter 7? Well, for one thing, we get criteria for what will count as the ultimate good or the final end or the greatest good. You know, there are different ways to phrase the same thing. There is some highest, most ultimate good, right? We've already touched on this point But we came at it through the route of the most superordinate science, right, back in chapter 2. Now we're coming at it more directly. Well, how do we know what the highest good is? And Aristotle gives us some criteria. So the highest good should be complete. And what he means by complete is basically intrinsically good, right? It's chosen for its own sake, right? And then the most complete good is chosen for its own sake and not for the sake of other things, right? And you could argue about whether that's what you mean by the most complete, but that is what Aristotle means. If something were, his point being, if something were chosen for its own sake and for the sake of something else, then you wouldn't be done when you'd achieved that good. There would be something else to get to complete the goodness. So then maybe it sounds odd, but the most complete is pursued only for its own sake, never for the sake of anything else. Once we grasp that part, we can easily see that happiness is like that, right? We mentioned honor, right? So honor has some intrinsic value. Aristotle allows, concedes, however you want to put that. It's a somewhat good thing, but also presumably people want to be honored because it makes them happy, right? So honor is not as complete as happiness. Happiness, in turn, isn't wanted for other things. Or to put it differently, you could say, well, I want to go to school because I'll get a good job, and I want a good job so I can contribute and have, creature comforts, and I want to do that so I can be happy. And then that's a natural place to stop. And if somebody else told you that, you probably wouldn't say, and why do you want to be happy? Right? And so that's what Aristotle is picking up on. He's saying, well, we don't normally say I want to be happy so I can get honor, or I want to be happy so I can get money. It's always the other way around. Well, money will make me happy, or honor will make me happy, at least in these limited circumstances it might, right? So happiness seems to be the most complete good. Pleasure is the tough case, so that's why I went with honor first. But Aristotle would certainly say, well, there are bad pleasures that will ultimately make you unhappy, right? If you get pleasure from being a sadist, say, you could eventually be ostracized from your community, or you could end up doing something criminal and being locked up, and ultimately your life will go poorly, and you'll wish that you hadn't pursued that pleasure, right? That's how Aristotle is thinking about things, that there are good pleasures and there are bad pleasures, and we want the good ones, and of course the good ones contribute to happiness, right? So pleasure isn't as complete as happiness, or even if it is, maybe this is the way Aristotle would put it, even if it is, some of them are bad and should be rejected. If we say they're not as complete as happiness, my reasoning would be, and Aristotle isn't this clear, well, we reject the ones that don't contribute to happiness, right? So then that implies that we are pursuing pleasures partly because of their contribution to happiness, right? Given the ones that we rejected and ruled out and said those won't contribute to happiness, we're allowing these in by implication because of their contribution to happiness. So Aristotle doesn't say all that, but that would be a way of making sense of various statements that he makes. All right, so the highest good should be completely complete. The highest good should be self-sufficient. Is happiness self-sufficient? Well, on a certain understanding of happiness, it is self-sufficient. So we do have to conceive it in the right way, right? And so I already said earlier that my happiness is not an isolated happiness. My happiness includes the happiness of some others, and that's important. I'm a social animal, right? Even though I consider myself fairly introverted, I'm not a super social animal, but yet, as a human, I'm a social animal. So happiness is self-sufficient as long as we understand that, well, if I'm happy, that includes the happiness of some others. Also, there are some resources I need for happiness. That comes up in a later chapter after this point. But Aristotle thinks of happiness as this sort of activity that uses certain resources and includes the happiness of some others. And so on this conception of happiness as an unimpeded activity, let's call it, yes, it is self-sufficient. I wouldn't be doing that activity in the first place if I didn't have the resources I need. So once you actually get to happiness, once the necessary conditions are in place, and there are some of those, when you have it, it's enough. It's self-sufficient, right? But yeah, certain things have to be in place. Okay, so the highest good should be complete, self-sufficient. Happiness is those. Is it the most choice-worthy? Meaning, would you choose it over other things? And Aristotle says yes. He makes an important qualification. Happiness is not generally counted as one good among others. So you can't just keep adding things to it and increase its value. So in other words, right, we say it's the most choice-worthy. So we're saying we choose it over other things. But somebody might say, well, what about happiness plus $1 million? Isn't that better than happiness? I mean, Aristotle's on to that. And so his counterclaim here is, now wait a minute. Happiness is the standard for whether your life is going well, right? So there's a right amount of money that, probably a range, maybe not an exact amount. So there's some right amount of money, there's a little bit of a range there that contributes to the good life for you, right? And you could have too little and it would impede your happiness, and you could have too much and it would impede your happiness. And there are various ways that could happen. It could make you less virtuous if you have too much money. It could make you sloppy. It could make you careless. It could make you a target, so people come after you and they want your money, right? Various things could happen. So happiness is the standard that determines how much money you should have. So you can't say things like, well, what about happiness and $1 million? What about happiness and a can of Coke? Right? Well, how many cans of Coke have you had recently? Right? I mean, it's sugar water. It's not that healthy. So again, happiness is the standard there. So if you're happy, you have enough money and you have enough cans of Coke and whatever else. So it's the most choice-worthy. But when we say that, this is like the discussion about self-sufficiency. We do have to see happiness as inclusive of just the right things that contribute to happiness. If we conceive it that way, then happiness is the most choice-worthy. Okay, so I'll say it one more time. Now we've got the 3 criteria. Happiness is completely complete. Happiness is self-sufficient. It's the most self-sufficient. Happiness is the most choice-worthy. And so now we know why and how it's the highest good, right? And it determines what else is good for us, right? As I've been arguing along the way. Okay. Now, as Aristotle says, but you know what? We already knew happiness was the highest good. it's funny how he says things like that. So it makes me laugh. He says things like this where he's argued at length, and then he'll pause and he'll say, but we already knew that. Well, okay, but you just gave us this really elaborate argument. Yeah, he likes to confirm things, Sometimes we already know the truth, but we like to confirm it. So that's what we've done. We've confirmed what we knew. But let me read to you what he says at 1097b, near line 20. He says, but to say that happiness is the best good is perhaps to say something that is apparently commonplace. And we still need a clearer statement of what it is. Maybe then this would come about if the function of a human being were grasped. For just as for a flute player, a sculptor, every craftsman, and in general for whatever has some function and action, the good, the doing well, seems to lie in the function, the same also seems to hold of a human being, if indeed there is some function that is his. Right? So in other words, yeah, happiness is the best good. That's great. But what does that mean? What is happiness really? I mean, apparently it's not pleasure or honor. So then what should we say? Well, happiness is the human good. So good humans have it. Right? That sounds like a sleight of hand, but really we're thinking about this biologically. Happiness is the human good. It's part of a flourishing human life, right? It's what makes us good of our kind, right? A frog is good when it can get the flies and hop well, right? We're good when we're happy. That's the kind of good we've been talking about. We've been talking about ourselves as biological beings. And this is whatever the happy life is, it's the kind of life that's good for us. So we haven't been focusing on biology, but that's been sort of in the background, operative in the background. And so now it's becoming more relevant. Let's think about this in terms of function, right? So we call a flute player good when the flute player performs his or her function well. In other words, when the flute player plays the flute well, we say that's a good flute player. And when the sculptor sculpts well, we say that's a good sculptor, right? So when the human being does the distinctively human function well, then we should say, that's a good human. So in other words, that's a happy human. So this argumentation sounds weird, but keep in mind Aristotle has had the biological notion of good in mind all along. It's not a sleight of hand, I wouldn't say, although it does sound weird. We're just using the resources we have. Okay, so what is the function of a human being? Well, that's a little complicated, but listen. Here's what we should say. So there is the vegetative soul that we share in common with plants, right? In other words, we have a metabolism. We keep ourselves alive. We grow. Certainly when we're children, we grow, and then unfortunately we might grow after that because we nourish ourselves and we might ingest too much, and so we grow bigger. And so again, I'm just saying we have a metabolism. We keep ourselves alive. We ingest nourishment from the environment, and it gets incorporated in our bodies. All that is part of the vegetative function, and we're capable of reproduction, just like plants are. All of that. Aristotle considers that part of the vegetative soul. So that all is, part of the functioning that we do and have. But it's not distinctive of us. And so we're not going to say that's the human function. Those are human functions, but that's not the human function. It turns out there's a highest function for humans that coordinates the other functions. There's, I guess we could use the word superordinate again. There's a superordinate function we're working toward here. Okay, and then there's the animal soul, which naturally we share with animals. And so animals have perception and desire. They desire things in their environment after they perceive them, and they can move themselves, right? And I mentioned this in another lecture already. These three things go together really well. Animals perceive things in their environment, perceive them as pleasant or potentially pleasant, and then go toward them, right? So those three functions, desire, perception, self-motion, self-movement, however you want to put that, those all go together really well. But we share those functions with animals, so that's not the distinctive human function. Not surprisingly, Aristotle ends up saying that reason is the distinctive human function, right? So a good human is a happy human, is a rational human, as it turns out. It's a human whose rationality maintains control, right? So in other words, they're capable of contemplation, not surprisingly, right? Their intellectual virtues are in good shape, let's say. I'm already tying happiness to virtue. Aristotle hasn't quite done that yet, but just in order to clarify what's going on here, I think I need to mention virtue. So rationality is the human function. It turns out there's a theoretical rationality, and then that helps us be good contemplative beings. And there's a practical rationality, and then that helps us make good decisions and regulate our emotions well. And we need virtues of character for that. Okay, so this has already come up in a different way because I already said, it turns out in Book 10 there are two good human lives. There's the life that emphasizes virtue of character. A different way to characterize that is it's the life of practical reason, right? So our rationality is in charge, but it's telling us what to do, and it's telling us which motivations to avoid and which motivations to cultivate. So it's an active-oriented or an action-oriented reason, right? And then on the other side, there's contemplation, which is just reason for the sake of reason, right? And those are both good lives, and hopefully we could combine them both. I would think by Aristotle's lights that contemplation is a better life, but also probably we shouldn't completely detach from our community and be contemplative hermits. Aristotle wouldn't argue for that either. So how about a combination of the two lives? Okay, so the good life for a human being is some kind of life of reason, living life in accord with that distinctively human function. So let me read again and see what Aristotle does with this. So this is 1098a, somewhere around line 6 or 7. Here's what he says. If then the function of a human being is activity of the soul in accord with reason or not without reason, and the function of a sort of thing we say is the same in kind as the function of an excellent thing of that sort, as in the case of a lyre player, and an excellent lyre player. Their function is the same. And this is unconditionally so in all cases when we add to the function the superiority that is in accord with the virtue. For it is characteristic of a lyre player to play the lyre and of an excellent one to do it well. If all this is so, and a human being's function is supposed to be a sort of living, and this living is supposed to be activity of the soul and actions that involve reason, and it is characteristic of an excellent man to do these well and nobly, and each is completed well when it is in accord with the virtue that properly belongs to it. If all this is so, the human good turns out to be activity of the soul in accord with virtue. And if there are more virtues than one, then in accord with the best and most complete. Furthermore, in a complete life, for one swallow does not make a spring, nor does one day. Nor similarly does one day or a short time make someone blessed and happy. So a lot of that I just read, I had already said. So basically, the good of a human being is the same, whether they perform their function really well or they don't perform it so well. The good is the same. And the difference is the really good human being performs the function really well, and the not so great human being doesn't perform it as well. Right? And what is that function? Well, it's a kind of life in accord with reason, and things that you do well, you do in accord with the appropriate virtue, right? Where we could think of virtue broadly as skill that contributes to something good, right? So you could think of the virtue as you could think of the virtues of a violinist. Nimbleness of the fingers would be in there, right? So there are different states and traits, some of them cultivated, some of them natural, that contribute to being good in your kind. When it comes to morality, we tend to think all these traits are cultivated traits. They're not natural ones. Aristotle will argue for that later, right? And so virtues of character are things that we cultivate. And the intellectual virtues, we can have some natural aptitude there, but those are also things we cultivate, right? So you live a good life and you're happy when you live in accord with the virtues, and then the virtues, as I've said, he doesn't quite get to that here yet. The virtues divide into two categories, the intellectual and the virtues of character. So we could live a very moral life, or we could live a very intellectual life, or we could combine both, and wouldn't that be great? Okay, and so that's what makes for a good human life. And then he's also adding here that when he says swallow, he means the bird. Just sorry if I'm saying something obvious, but just to be clear, he's talking about when the birds show up in the spring, right? They migrated south, and then one lone bird shows up, and it's singing its song, it's tweeting, whatever it's doing. It's not yet spring, it's just one bird, right? And so he's just making an analogy and saying, well, exercising your reason here and there or for a short time, that's not the good life yet for a human being. But over the span of a long time, whatever is a long time by human standards, if you manage to do that, that's a good, happy life, right? And so that's the whole account. The whole account is, one more time, human happiness is living in accord with reason, which involves living a life of virtue, but virtue divides into two, intellectual virtues and moral virtues. And you have to do this over a long span of time, right? By human standards, just whatever that means. So a rational life over the course of 30 or 40 adult years would be a happy life. If it's cut short, if you had only 10 years of strong, rational activity, right? And then something bad happened to cut it short. Well, it was as happy as it could be, is the sort of thing Aristotle might say. I mean, we do find that sort of situation unfortunate. So in a way, that's not a completely happy life, right? So the length of time matters. And also, I don't think Aristotle says it in what I just read, but he makes it clear elsewhere in this chapter and surrounding chapters. Activity matters. It's not the possession of virtue, right? Well, he used the word activity here, so that's clear enough. But he also argues against just having virtue. That's not the point. So some philosophers emphasize the possession of virtue. Maybe Socrates was one of them. It's not the possession of virtue that's the point, right? It's the activity, right? And this does go back to an earlier discussion about, well, look, whatever the ultimate goal is, that's what lends value to the rest. Now, you get virtue and you possess virtue so you can be virtuous, right? So possessing virtue isn't the greatest good when it comes to virtue. It's acting on your virtue, right? Okay, so that's a pretty good, complete picture of what counts as happiness for Aristotle. I'm going to pause again. Now that we're done with chapter 7, we should be able to finish up the Nicomachean ethics pretty quickly, relatively quickly. I want to say a little bit about chapter 8, a little bit about chapter 9. I'll say something about chapter 10, even though it's not in the excerpts in your textbook. There's a point I want to make about it anyway, so I'll do that. Chapter 13 shouldn't take too long because it has a lot to do with the way Aristotle wants to partition the human soul, and I already went ahead and started talking about that. Okay, chapter 8 is a few different things. A lot of it is devoted to comparing the view that emerged in chapter 7 to common views about happiness and the good life, right? And I don't want to go over all of this stuff, but I will say that virtue is emphasized, right? A lot of people before Aristotle and probably contemporaneous with Aristotle emphasized virtue, and they thought of it as the good life, right? And so Aristotle wants to emphasize the role of virtue here, but he also wants to say that his view is distinct, right? So I've already mentioned that possession of virtue isn't enough. Happiness is a kind of flourishing and a kind of living well, and so it's an activity, right? And of course, you need the virtues for the activity to be done well, but happiness is ultimately an activity and not the possession of something, right? And so active virtue is really what you want, as we've already said. Something that's new to us here is Aristotle says there are some conditions that have to be in place for a person to be happy, conditions that we haven't mentioned entirely. We've mentioned having friends, but let's look at this list here near the end of chapter 8. This would be 1099a, line 30. So, excuse me, we read, all the same, it apparently needs external goods to be added, it being happiness. It apparently needs external goods to be added, as we said, since it is impossible or not easy to do noble actions or virtuous actions, in other words, or actions that stem from virtue. It's not easy to do them without supplies. For just as we perform many actions by means of instruments, we perform many by means of friends, wealth, and political power. Then again, there are some whose deprivation disfigures blessedness, such as good breeding, good children, and noble looks. For we scarcely have the stamp of happiness if we are extremely ugly in appearance, ill-bred, living a solitary life, or childless, and have it even less, presumably, if our children or friends are totally bad or were good but have died. Okay, so some of that seems a little prejudicial, but let me try to get what's important here. Right, so you shouldn't think that political power or wealth has nothing to do with happiness. Now, happiness is an unimpeded activity. We've already mentioned friends, right? But also wealth. If you drop below a certain level of wealth, you'll be impeded, right? So there is such a thing as too much wealth. I've already mentioned that. But if you have so little wealth that you can't give your friends any gifts, say, right, then that impedes your ability to be generous. That's just one example. Right, you might need to travel, right, to see the world, to become an educated person, to have more to contemplate, right? Maybe you need to go somewhere else to go to a good university, right? You need to transplant yourself. There are lots of things you could do with your money that aren't materialistic. Let's put it that way. There are plenty of things you could do with your money that would promote virtue, that would involve virtue, that would be virtuous, right? And so then if you don't have any money, you can't do those things, and your virtue is impeded and your happiness is impeded. Political power doesn't mean, like you need to be elected state representative or anything like that. It does mean that you're socially engaged, and maybe you get to be the treasurer for the choir or something like that, right? Those offices are useful to other people. So again, the main point would be, well, you can exercise your virtue if you have some responsibilities, if you're in charge of some things. It's not about helping your friends and punishing your enemies. It's not like that. It's just, doing a good job as the treasurer of the choir, or, the president of this other nonprofit board, or whatever it is. That is an exercise in virtue. That is an exercise in dealing with people in the right way. I was the president of a nonprofit choir, so I'm speaking from experience here. There's a lot of interaction. There's a lot of dealing with people in the right way, and getting them to help the choir. So you have to be your best, so you can get people to help the choir. And then in my case, we felt like our choir had a mission to sort of bring music to the community, so then you're helping the community as well. And all of that seems virtuous. So that's the sort of thing Aristotle is talking about here. So that's one kind of good. There are things that are useful for you when you're trying to do virtuous action, right? And then there are necessary conditions, which is a different set of things. You need good breeding, good children, and noble looks. I mean, he's exaggerating, but what is he really trying to say? Well, good breeding sounds snobby. What he's talking about, though, is something we already mentioned. You have to have been brought up in such a way that you know what the starting points are. Otherwise, you're impeded. I mean, some people have a terrible childhood, where it's just emotional, financial chaos, and they they're anxious, right? Or whatever, whatever. They have some kind of emotional reaction to that that's not healthy. And that can impede them. It can impede their happiness. So he's saying something reasonable there, even though good breeding doesn't sound like a great phrase. I'll grant you. Good children, well, there's individual choice. Not everybody wants to have children. So I could leave it at that. But I will add, well, that is its own skill set, right? Maybe we could broaden that to dealing with young people and sort of helping them along. There maybe is a certain set of virtues involved there, so there have to be children that you're interacting with and dealing with, right, in order for you to develop those virtues specifically. I know that's not quite what he said, but if we try to make optimal sense of it, maybe that's what he should have said. Noble looks, he's getting carried away there. What he's thinking is, and I'm not defending this one, he's thinking about impediments again. He's thinking, well, if you're horribly ugly, you'll have trouble interacting with other people, which is possibly true. But, I suppose there's a question about whether that's their problem or your problem, right? You could adjust to that and work around it and actually develop a lot of skill and virtue in dealing with other people's horrified reactions to you and what you look like. So that one doesn't really pass muster, but it's interesting to think about why he said what he said and think about what we should say alternatively. Okay. What do we want to say about chapter 9? Well, I'll simply say that virtue is emphasized again. It seems like in chapter 9, he's trying to think about, whether he's basically thinking about whether happiness is something that occurs naturally, or it's a gift from the gods, or it's some other thing. And so he ends up emphasizing virtue to answer the question, right? Well, virtue isn't a gift from the gods, and it wouldn't be appropriate anyway. We should be responsible for our own virtue. And virtue isn't natural, but it isn't unnatural. And this will come up more in book 2, but I might as well say it now. Virtue is the sort of thing we can acquire by nature, right? I did already say, virtues are cultivated traits, right? So there are the natural dispositions we have. There's our personality. We tend to use that word to cover natural traits that we have and natural quirks. Virtues are cultivated traits. They're ways we've learned to deal with the environment and our emotional responses to the environment. And we're sort of navigating both all the time. We got to deal with the environment. We got to deal with our natural emotional responses to the environment. And virtue takes both into account and tries to get the best outcome based on both. Okay, so that's all we need to say about chapter 9. And then I did say I wanted to say something about chapter 10, even though it's not here, so I'll just tell you, and you don't need to read it. You don't need to go find a copy somewhere. Aristotle raises the issue of whether we can be happy in our lifetimes, which might sound like a weird issue to raise. But the point is, it was a sort of Greek convention or trope. People thought a lot about whether we should really call a person happy while they're alive. Maybe we should wait till they're dead. That's how the thinking went. When they're dead, we already know how their whole life trajectory went. and there aren't going to be any more reversals of fortune. So we should be careful about calling people happy, right? So Aristotle is responding to that line of thinking, and he's saying, well, happiness is somewhat stable. There are reversals of fortune, it's true. And given what he already said, in chapters 8 and 9, he would have to admit that some of those reversals of fortune could impede your happiness. However, again, he wants to emphasize the role of virtue. People can't take virtue away from you, right? Or if you lost all your money somehow and it wasn't your fault, it wasn't anything you did, that doesn't take your virtue away. So happiness is not this completely unstable thing, right? When you have virtue, you have the largest portion of what you need. And so someone who's already virtuous is going to do as well as they can when they've lost their fortune or when their children die, right? That's something that came up. How can you be happy when all your children have died? Well, you'll do the best you can. You'll do as well as anybody could do under those circumstances. And so you'll be happy, but it'll be tied to those particular circumstances. You'll be happy for someone in that mode of life, right, with those impediments. Okay, so we already said the good is very situational, right? So here it is again. Yeah, if you have virtue, I suppose that's one thing you would want across situations, but if you have virtue, you'll do the best you can in whatever your situation is. So that particular happiness, that particular category of goodness, is affected by the situation. And we could at least say, well, that's a flourishing kind of life, given that person's life circumstances, right? And I think that's a reasonable thing to say. Also, I haven't said this yet, but this was a chapter 8 issue, if I'm remembering correctly. Yes, I am. The happy life is pleasant, right? That it's important to say that, so I'm going to the trouble of saying it out of order after I accidentally skipped it. Aristotle denies that pleasure is the highest good. So it's important to say that he doesn't think pleasure is bad. It's just not the highest good. The virtuous life comes with its own sort of pleasure, and so happiness has a built-in sort of pleasure, right? And it wouldn't be the pleasure of the senses, it's the pleasure of exercising virtue, right? You wouldn't, as Aristotle says, you wouldn't call someone just if they hated doing justice. That's not what you expect from the just person, and you wouldn't call someone moderate if they hate being moderate, or temperate if they hate being temperate. That would be weird. If they're temperate, they like doing temperate actions. If they're just, they like doing just actions. So as you develop the virtues, you also develop a liking for virtuous action. And so, again, the life of virtue, the life of active virtue, comes with its own pleasure, and then that's what happiness is. It is the life of active virtue. So happiness comes with its own distinctive pleasure. All right, so what's going on in chapter 13? Well, I suppose the main point of chapter 13 is something we've already said. We've realized that happiness has to do with virtue, so we'd better investigate virtue. So this is a setup for book 2. Book 2 is all about virtue and what it is, and we actually start to get into specific virtues in book 2, right? So that's the main point of chapter 13, just setting up the discussion of the virtues, explaining why we need to investigate virtue. And then this issue about the two kinds of virtue comes up again, right? So I'll just say it again. There's theoretical virtue or intellectual virtue, probably a better way to put it, and virtue of character, right? And then how do those line up with the different parts of the soul? Let's state it clearly here. So we could distinguish the rational part of the soul and the non-rational, but then each has multiple parts. Okay, so the non-rational includes the vegetative soul and the animal soul. And we mentioned the functions for each of those, right? The vegetative soul is like having a metabolism, basically being alive, being capable of growth and reproduction, right? That's the vegetative soul. That is completely non-rational, has nothing to do with reason. Now, the animal soul sort of gets counted twice in a way, because on the one hand, Aristotle says it's the non-rational part, right? It's desire and perception and self-movement. None of that is reason, neither kind of reason, right? So it's non-rational. However, it's rational in the sense that this is the part that can listen to reason. So what Aristotle is telling you here is, okay, so in the animal part of the soul, there are desires, okay? And those desires are shaped by emotional responses, right? And so the rational part has to guide the desires and the emotional responses, and that ultimately affects perception as well. Right, so the animal part of the soul has perception and desire, and then those are conditioned by the rational part. So there's a part that listens to reason, and then there's the part that possesses reason. Okay, so animal, vegetable, completely non-rational, animal, non-rational in one way, rational in another. And then the part that has reason and commands with reason is the rational part, but that also divides into two parts, as we've said, right? So there's the part that is constantly dealing with desire and emotion. That is practical reason, right? So practical reason is trying to navigate the world, and as I already said, it's dealing with the externalities, like what the world is like and what's happening in the world, and also dealing with the emotional responses coming from the animal part and trying to get the best outcome. So I feel like I have to give an example to make that clear. Courage is not just a matter of wisdom. If it were, it would be an entirely cerebral affair, and you would just decide what to do on the battlefield, and you'd do that. It's not that simple. So you get on the battlefield, and you have lots of strong feelings, right? And so fear can come up, and probably should, and confidence can come up, and should to some extent. Right, and so courage, which is a virtue, has to navigate, here's what's happening on the battlefield, the enemy is approaching, I think I could take this person, right, but not that person, and also I'm kind of scared and want to run away, but also when I look and focus on this one person over here that I think I can take, I feel emboldened and confident. Right, what am I going to do with all that? Well, that's a matter for practical reason that has to use its judgment, has to use experience. This is not a matter for pure rationality. One has to draw on one's experience. If the guy that you can handle is next to this other guy that you can't, but then, you got Hercules back here, and he's going to take care of the stronger guy. Go for it, right? Squash down the fear you're feeling. Tell yourself it's not completely rational because I could take this guy and Hercules could take that guy. So here we go, we're moving forward, right? And that would be a case of, reason sort of navigating what's out there and what I'm feeling at the same time. Okay, so that hopefully that little example helps you make sense of all this. Okay, so we've got what we need from chapter 13. We're transitioning into a discussion of virtue, and in some sense there are 4 parts of the soul, but in another sense there are only 3. I mean, I would say there are 3. I don't know why Aristotle makes this overly complicated. Let's say there are 3 parts of the soul: vegetative, which is metabolism, reproduction; animal, perception, desire, self-movement; and human or rational, which is reason, right? So that's the basic view. But he ends up saying, oh, well, the non-rational has 2 parts because of the vegetable and animal, and the rational has 2 parts because, reason is telling the animal part what to do and it's listening, and so there are 2 parts there. There are 3 parts, and the rational part is in charge, right? And so that's why reason matters so much for our happiness. There is a hierarchy among the functions in our soul, and reason is suited to command. It naturally commands. And so your task as an ethical being is to cultivate that and to do things that will allow reason to maintain control and make sure it's the best kind of control. Okay. So that's book 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics. I hope that was helpful. Thanks.